Appropriations to come speak to us right now. He was just over the Capitol a matter of 10 minutes ago. Jay Dardenne is not an unfamiliar face, obviously having served as Commissioner of Administration since January of 2016. Before that, of course, he was Lieutenant Governor, Secretary of State, and a member of the Senate here. And then I believe you started your career as the VR Metro Council. I did a little research. Anyway, so appreciate Jay coming here. Just some things to know. Only members of the press club, as well as members of the media, can ask questions. Please no speeches. And Jay, if you can repeat the questions when you're asked them. Without further ado, Commissioner of Administration, Jay Dardenne.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Nice to be with you. I just left the Appropriations Committee where we were having a little tete-a-tete about how we ought to resolve this interesting situation we find ourselves in. Is Sue Lincoln here? Sue Lincoln called me a little while ago and said that we needed a poem about this session. I hadn't even thought about that, but you've inspired me. So this is my ode to the 2017 session. It's rather brief, but it started with lots of hot air and ended with a bust. No one around the Capitol could determine who to trust. On the day the Fighting Tigers won their biggest game, the strategy in government was to figure out who to blame. There was nary a walk-off homer nor a sacrificial bunt. The legislature met for 45 days and all they did was punt. So we gather again in Baton Rouge to wail and moan and jaw. Let's just get this over and head to Omaha. That's my feeling right now, I can tell you that. You know, I saw the Advocate on the front page had a little blurb that it had been 17 years since the legislature adjourned without having a budget. There was no real follow-up to that. It was just a little notation, but it did get me to thinking because I was there when that happened. In fact, I was chairman of the Finance Committee when that happened. We did a little digging, and I found it pretty interesting to read the articles that were written at that time. This was on June 12th. I'm sorry, this was in must have been the year 2000. It was the first year of the Foster's second term. I was the chairman of the Finance Committee. Jerry Luke LeBlanc was chairman of the Appropriations Committee. And I remember very vividly our discussions in conference committee as we were trying to report that bill in the waning moments of the session, just like what was going on this year. That was the year that the Stelly plan passed, and there had been some tax increases proposed, and there was a lot of uncertainty as to what kind of revenue would be generated. So it was not an acrimonious ending like we saw last week. It was a difficult, confusing ending, but it was basically Jerry Luke looking at me and saying, I can't explain this budget or what's in it, and I said, I can't either. And we said, we're not going to go ask the legislators to vote on a budget that we can't explain without knowing what revenue might be available to be spent. So Jerry Luke said, I can't stand before you and represent a bill that we have not confirmed the revenue measure and exactly what they're raising. I said, we don't know what revenues are available to us. A lot of the discussion on the floor did that session, see if this sounds familiar, said, I don't want to see hospitals closed, nursing homes adversely affected, our colleges and universities, law enforcement. John Hilario said the extra sales tax was a bridge to get the state through a budget crunch while voters decide whether to increase income taxes. Does that sound familiar? 17 years later, we're repeating the exact same type discussion, and this so-called bridge of an extra penny sales tax now looks like it may be the only thing that can get passed at some point in the future if there's when there's a special session to try and deal with the fiscal cliff. The governor made it very clear from the get-go this was a temporary tax designed to bridge us to fiscal reform. Well, we got on the bridge to fiscal reform, but then we fell off of it because it didn't lead us anywhere. With nothing happening during this legislative session, the one that was targeted to be the fiscal reform session based upon the recommendations of the tax task force that very studiously looked at what best practices were and what Louisiana ought to be doing in terms of changing its tax system. Now, I have not heard a single person stand up and defend Louisiana's tax system. If anybody here wants to do that, I welcome you to do it. But I haven't heard legislators, I haven't heard pundits, I haven't heard good government groups, I haven't heard anybody say, we've got the right system, stop trying to tinker with it. I think it's a universally accepted principle that our tax system is broken and is inefficient and is not appropriate for the people of Louisiana and their needs, not their wants, but their needs in 2017. Nonetheless, nobody seems to want to do anything about it. At least legislatively, no one seems to want to do anything about it. Last year, with this shortfall, a huge shortfall looming, the answer was to put on the legislative throwback jerseys and impose temporary sales taxes. 1 cent additional sales tax, reduce some exemptions and exclusions with a promise that 2017 would be the year to address real reform. 2017 hasn't come and gone yet, but the regular session, fiscal session, when that could be done, has absolutely come and gone. The task force, and I know a couple of members are with us today, the task force very clearly stated a couple of things. And this was about as bipartisan a group as you're going to find. There were no political agendas. There were a couple of politicians or former politicians like me on it, but it was good government people, representatives of business and industry, trying to say what's the best practice. We unanimously agreed that the extra penny of sales tax had to go. That was just not a good tax policy. That there ought to be modifications in our state income tax, particularly not allowing the deductibility of federal income tax, which only a couple of other states do. And that there should not be any effort to examine the property tax because we knew that that was a non-starter in so many people's minds. Even though it's a big linchpin in local government funding and what have you, it was decided that that was simply not an area where we thought that people were ready to go, recognizing that some of these things would take a vote of the people, constitutional amendments. The legislators, ever conscious of that one word that seems to strike fear in their hearts, stelly, made it clear that any change in the income tax was not going to happen. And the result of that is that the governor didn't abandon the task force's recommendation. To the contrary, he embraced all of it, but he did introduce another element that was beyond the scope of the task force's recommendation, and it was admittedly hastily put together in this commercial activity tax. It was offered as yet another alternative based upon the input he had received from legislators across the state that they weren't going to fool with the income tax. There had to be ideas, there had to be purposes out there for discussion, and that was one of them. It fell on its face, obviously, legislatively, and it did have some problems with it. But the idea was the governor was going to lay some options out there and say, we got to talk about these things. We got to figure out solutions. Unfortunately, it seems like he was the only branch of government that chose to do so, with a couple of exceptions. And I give Representative Biden and Representative Stokes credit for advancing ideas and aggressively trying to do their homework and do their research about getting some ideas before the legislature be considered. But at the end of the day, nothing was done. We'll be back again in a special session in the next several months or early next year, and everything will start over again, and the same ideas are going to be on the table. I don't look for any new revolutionary income ideas to be put forward when we're facing this billion-dollar-plus cliff that is literally going to shut down government as we know it if there's not some income identified to fill the void that will be created if these taxes roll off. And that's why the most frequently discussed option is simply to do what was done 20, 30 years ago, keep renewing a temporary tax. Have Wall Street look at us and say, haven't y'all figured out what you did once when you enacted the Stelly plan? And we told you getting rid of temporary taxes was going to help your bond rating, and it did immediately. And here we go again about to repeat those same practices of simply renewing temporary taxes. I dare say the legislature is not going to be interested in making that penny permanent. I don't think they should, but they probably won't take the step of trying to make it permanent. They'll say, well, we'll just do it for another couple of years to get past the next election, and then we'll continue to talk about it. It's unfortunate, because this was going to be the moment in time when fiscal reform had a real opportunity to happen. Now, there were a lot of things done wrong over the course of the past 100 years, but the three things I want to mention to you are among our brightest constitutional protections that are placed in the Louisiana Constitution, and they're the three things that have come under fire for the first time ever as members of the House of Representatives try and stymie any success that may be attributable to our government. First, there's the Bond Security and Redemption Fund that affords our creditors the strongest possible protection in the country. All state receipts flow through the Bond Security and Redemption Fund. That means that every dollar we take in is going to be available to pay our debts. We are not going to default on our bonded indebtedness. You can be sure you're going to be paid. And Wall Street recognizes that and gives us credit for having a great system that ensures that our creditors will be paid. But if you think back to the last session, the entire discussion in the waning days of the session centered around the proposal that the Speaker had to allow statutory dedications to be peeled off and help pay our bonded indebtedness. Remember, this was the great idea that the House had that was going to solve all our problems. And the Treasurer was directed to study that and make recommendations on how it may be implemented. Have you heard a peep about that in this session? Absolutely not. The Treasurer said it can't be done. It's not practical. It's not feasible. It makes no sense. We can't do it. And so that alternative has been abandoned. During all this discussion about the budget, you didn't hear a thing about that subject that occupied much of the debate during the previous special session. So one option was to look at this great constitutional protection we have and try and do something that really would have gotten Wall Street's attention in a negative way. The state's financial advisor cautioned against doing it. The Treasurer couldn't fully explain its logistics and how it would work, and the Senate overwhelmingly rejected it as a concept. So it was a gimmick that was designed to help avoid having to raise taxes or make cuts in the budget. It didn't work. We've heard nothing else about it. Did you hear a word in this session about it? No, you didn't. A quiet death after the Treasurer and legislative staffs panned the concept as unworkable and unnecessary. Secondly, we have a revenue stabilization fund, a budget stabilization fund, the rainy day fund, a sensible constitutional provision that allows for a forced savings account to be tapped when revenues lag. Since its creation, it has been routinely used by legislators to assist in times of budget stress. Multiple times under the Gentle administration, without a peep from so many of the members of the legislature who still serve in that body. The rains came under a Republican governor. The rainy day fund was tapped. The rains certainly came under this governor, and we can't use all the money that's available to us in the rainy day fund was the reaction. We spent an entire special session arguing about whether to use the constitutionally allowable rainy day money, $119 million, to close the budget gap and avoid extraordinary cuts. Instead, at the end of the day, $98 million wound up being spent, and all the wailing and gnashing of teeth resulted in that differential. And so a little portion of the rainy day fund was not spent. Third constitutional provision now, the revenue estimating conference. You know, in the old days, the governor and the commissioner of administration sat around and scratched their head and decided how much money they wanted the state to spend that year. And so the price of oil was adjusted accordingly. Back in the 80s, the state budget was 40% dependent upon mineral revenue. 40%. And now it's just barely in the low low teens. But that was how we decided what the state's budget would be. The people wisely adopted a revenue estimating conference, which is not a scientific process. It's called an estimating conference. It's an estimate. It's a best guess. Yet it is the thing that is most being vilified in the regular session this year, that the revenue estimating conference is always wrong, and so we shouldn't spend the money that they say is available. The revenue estimating conference takes a unanimous vote, and half its membership is the legislature. The legislature, the Commissioner of Administration, and Jim Richardson, a trusted economist, are the ones who have to unanimously agree on what the state's budget will be. Never before have we said, well, let's don't spend that revenue estimating conference because that's constitutionally what we base our revenue on. But this session, the regular session, the entire focus was on this notion that we can't dare spend all that money. It would be fiscally irresponsible to do so. The governor was the very first person to mention that maybe we ought to look at a process that does not spend all the money in a given year. But he made it very clear that we weren't going to do that until we stabilized our budget and had real, meaningful tax reform upon which we could rely as a source of revenue, instead of the topsy-turvy situation we have right now, where we have a corporate income tax that actually pays more back to the taxpayer than collects from the taxpayer. And We haven't done anything that we really need to do to address the exemptions and credits and exclusions and so on. And so that idea may be something we want to incorporate at some point in the future when the budget is more stable, but it's certainly not the answer right now. And as we speak right now, department heads and agencies are testifying before the Appropriations Committee about the impact of $206 million in cuts, which is what the House wants, and what the bill they're considering today does, and what it would mean to their respective budgets, and what a backward step it would be. The committee or the House didn't bother to hear from those people who are actually going to be implementing the budget in the regular session. The House simply adopted the amendment. The House committee adopted the amendment without hearing anything of the consequences of not spending $206 million. And the House dutifully went along, passing the budget on to the Senate, which, in my view and our view, responsibly fixed it, fully funded TOPS, avoided the cuts in LDH that are going to be necessary, DCFS, pushed that 13th payment as the House had suggested. The Senate agreed, we reluctantly agreed as well, because it was really the only option to avoid the severe cuts that we're facing. But we still are talking about the Revenue Estimating Conference. So 3 of the very best constitutional protections we have put in place over the course of the past year and a half have been the policies that seem to be called under fire by the House. Not by the Senate, but by the House. So I would suggest to you those are some of the best reforms we've ever put in place in Louisiana, and that their intent and their specific language ought to be acknowledged, and we ought to be grateful that we have those provisions instead of trying to find ways to not use them. So we have now faced a budget situation that collapsed on the last day of the session, despite the fact that there was a generally held belief early in the last day of the session that there had been an agreement, there had been an understanding. And where the administration is today is exactly where we were last week, and exactly what we had put in place to happen, and that is to adopt the Senate budget, spend the available revenue based upon the REC forecast, and also, and this just got overlooked apparently in the waning moments of the session, and enact the Senate concurrent resolution that was passed that basically legislatively urged and requested the administration to do the same thing that we did on our own last year, and that is instruct agencies and departments to be prudent and not to go spend all their money willy-nilly right off the bat in the fiscal year, but to expect that there may be a mid-year deficit. And if there is, have some money in reserve. And we did that on our own last year, and the departments and agencies complied. And when the first budget deficit hit, the first $300-some-odd million of budget deficit, there were not dramatic cuts in services because they had already planned on the reality that they may have to reduce their budgets accordingly. And the same thing can and will happen in this fiscal year. Even though we're hopeful things may be a little bit better on the revenue front, with or without legislative direction, I'm going to tell the departments and agencies right when the session ends, be cautious. Last year we had 2 mid-year cuts. We may have one, we're not sure, but we want you to be cautious. The biggest misunderstanding in the session, and it's very frustrating, is that, and I just told the Appropriations Committee this because many of the members of that committee were guilty of this, legislators thought, well, we just don't have to appropriate that money, and if we need it in the middle of the year, we'll go get it. Well, that's not the way it works. If the money is not appropriated, it cannot be spent unless the legislature is called into session in a special session or in a supplemental appropriation bill in next year's legislative session. So our view is appropriate the money, let us manage it as we're supposed to do responsibly as the executive branch of government, and don't put yourself in a position where you may put $200-some-odd million in the netherworld where it can't be accessed, which is exactly what would happen. And by the way, what would happen if, God forbid, we have another hurricane and we have an above-average chance of a major storm this year in the Gulf? NOAA has told us. Bad news, unfortunate news in terms of their projections. Now, I'm not sure their projections are any better than REC. It's a guess, it's an estimate, but historically they tell us there is a greater likelihood of a severe storm or more in the Gulf this year. If that happens and the state has to spend money, remember what happens. We have to advance that money. Agencies and departments have to expend money in hurricane relief and in response and in cleanup and in everything else that you do responsibly to take care of the people of this state. It's what happened in the floods last year. Agencies and departments had to spend money that had been budgeted for something else on the disaster because you got to spend the money first to get reimbursed by FEMA. So that $200 million could be very significant to agencies and departments who don't have it available to them if they have to call upon a large amount of money to deal with the hurricane response. So just another reason why we think the appropriate thing to do, the responsible thing to do in our current budget situation is to appropriate the money and let this administration do what it's done prudently since we've been in office, and that is transparently manage the state dollars responsibly, report to the legislature on what we're doing, answer all their questions, and make certain that we are not going to fall into the trap of Louisiana's ghosts of the past, and that is using non-recurring dollars to fund recurring expenses, sweeping funds to make it look like you have more money than you have, but to actually only spend the dollars that are available to us by the constitutional body, the RAC, that tells us what's available. So with that, I'll stop and try and answer whatever questions you may have. I didn't certainly touch on a lot of things I wanted to mention, but I'll let you ask questions instead and see if some of the topics come up.
You mentioned the extending the penny sales tax for the fiscal year. Do you have any expectation that the legislature and the governor can agree on any other solution besides that? And if not, is the administration open to extend the sales tax if it comes down to that, or facing a budget of $1.5 billion?
The governor has said that he does not favor extending that penny of sales tax. But by the same token, we obviously recognize that the state cannot suffer a literally $1 billion, $2 or $3, whatever it may be, reduction in its budget. And we're certainly going to consider whatever options the legislature may choose to consider. But that is not something the governor wants to do. We called it, the legislature called it a temporary tax. We called it a bridge, and that's exactly what we felt it would be. And we don't think the penny sales tax extension is the answer to Louisiana's fiscal woes.
Aren't there a number of exemptions, additional exemptions that have passed this year? Would the governor veto those if he sees the process as flawed?
I don't know. I can't speak to that because I haven't had any discussion with him about it, so I don't know. I know he's looking carefully at all the bills that have passed. Obviously, we're now in the veto mode, if you will. But I don't know what he's going to do about those additional exemptions, quite frankly. Yes.
Commissioner Dardenne, you mentioned frustration about the lack of adoption of the task force with regard to deductibility of federal income tax. What would you say to someone that would say, okay, I don't want my deduction taken away, but yet yours and those of others who draw six-figure state pensions get to deduct 100% basically and pay no taxes on it? Don't you think that message may be somewhat hard to convey to those that, you know, I don't want my deduction taken away. You've got yours out there. With reference to Julie Stokes, she was asked that question about perhaps going after that. She said this legislature would not have they wouldn't be willing to do it. I'll just phrase it that way.
My guess is that's probably right. They wouldn't be willing to do it, and it applies to all state employees and all state retirees. It's not a single person or a single individual, but I think when you talk about tax policy and you look at the deductibility of federal income tax at both the corporate level and the individual level, we're an outlier. That's not the norm nationally. And the plan that was out there, the recommendation of the task force and the legislation that was advanced by the governor, by eliminating those deductions and lowering rates would provide a significant tax break to a number of individual taxpayers. And I think that's why it makes sense to look at that deduction as something that we ought to change.
Well, a quick follow-up then, would it not be perhaps advisable to say, and everybody recognizes that the vast majority of state workers don't make huge pensions, that's just a fact, but perhaps having an exemption of, say, whatever the number, 40,000, 50,000, and only the amount above that?
I think that'd be very reasonable.
Okay. Thank you.
One of the differences that the House HB 1 is being proposed today from what was passed out of the House in May
Nada. It is the bill. It is the reengrossed version of the bill reintroduced by the chairman. And it is what's being debated right now in the House Committee.
Are there pay raises for state workers?
No.
Rural motivation officers?
No.
Is there any wiggle room you all negotiated over the weekend?
No, I didn't. I know there were some discussions. I know that there were some communications over the weekend. I wasn't personally involved. I was actually out of town. So.
Both sides hardened in their positions. Is there going to be, or are we going to find ourselves this time next week in the same position?
Jay, could you repeat the
I'm
question?
sorry. I'm sorry. The question was, what is the bill that is presently being considered by the House Appropriations Committee? The answer was it's the exact same bill that was passed by the House last week. And then follow-up, have the positions hardened on both sides. And I would say, no, I don't sense that that's the case. I'm hoping and I believe that legislators don't want to be here again next week. They recognize their obligation to pass a budget. They don't want to face the unprecedented reality of July 1 rolling around and not having a budget. And so I think there's going to be a willingness to try and get things done. And I think the proposal that we have made and that we've advanced is a responsible way to resolve it. And in fact, many of us, and I'm one of them, believe that would have passed the House had there been an opportunity to bring that to a vote. And that's one of the frustrations, I think, is if it was not an effort to try and allow the House to vote on the plan that got 36 votes in the Senate and that fully funded TOPS and provided the pay raises and did all the things, or avoids all the things that are the reality under the current budget bill. And I believe that there are enough members of the House, and particularly the Republican members of the House, who want to see this resolved. And I'm hoping that as the dust settles here in the next few days, that's going to happen.
You said something to the effect of they were maybe not aware of the fact that you had to appropriate $100 million or $50 million or whatever. It couldn't be just in another region. What is the administration doing now to speak directly to maybe some of the moderate Republicans who maybe weren't part of the leadership?
I just gave that speech to the House Appropriations Committee moments ago. And we'll continue to be messaging that with everybody to ask them, do you know, do you realize this is the case? And we just had a little discussion about that in committee. So I think it's now pretty clear that not appropriating the money does not mean it can be used absent being called into session or in next year's regular session.
What else is the administration doing to, because obviously the appropriation committee is selected by the speaker and those who didn't sign off on the agreement. Right. So do you have a plan to educate others?
Oh yeah, we're talking to everybody that we can talk to make sure they know and they're comfortable. And obviously we know a significant number of House members are very comfortable with the Senate budget, prepared to vote for it last week and are still prepared to vote for it. So the universe of people who need convincing is not huge.
So one other area, no gasoline tax passed. You talked about highways being an ongoing problem. There's no revenue to do anything at this point. Earlier you had said, I think, something about, creating a Washington exit could be done in a certain way. Are there any plans absent new revenue to help with the infrastructure?
I think the Washington exit option, yes, there is a plan underway, as I appreciate it, that there may be some dollars available to do that. But beyond that, there are not dollars available for the major infrastructure problems that we've all recognized. The bridge in Baton Rouge, the widening of I-10, the bridge in Lake Charles, the completion of I-49 north and south. Those major projects are not going to be funded with the dollars that we have available.
Jay, if I may follow up on that. There was talk that the general fund might have to subsidize the highway department just to meet the federal match requirements. Is that the case yet, or are we close to that?
We're close to that. We thought early on that it was the case this year that we were going to be $42 million short in funding the department this year. We now believe that the department can use toll credits for the current fiscal year. It's one of the reasons why I started talking about the $400 million as opposed to the $440 million that had not been funded in the budget. So we've got another year to limp by with toll credits, but that doesn't really pay the bills to get the projects actually done. And after this year, we will not have any availability for federal matching dollars. So next year, in addition to the cliff, we may also be facing a situation where the general fund is needed to make certain we can draw down federal dollars for road improvements. Yes, sir.
budget is $26 million, is that correct?
Yeah, it's a little bit more than that, I think. I'll know exactly what that is. It's in that little amount.
I'm just an old engineer from Georgia Tech, but the shortfall is what, 90 million? How much are you short to balance the budget? Right?
Well, the budget is going to be balanced no matter what. And we're not short for balancing the budget. The debate is over whether all the dollars that can be appropriated are actually appropriated. But you're correct in the direction you're headed. And the question was about the real shortfall in the budget right now. And the answer is we were arguing about $50 to $100 million in that range. The House wanted to save $206 million by not appropriating it. The Senate chose to appropriate everything, but agreed that $50 million would be the subject of the discussion that we would have with state departments and agencies about what they would be cognizant of as the budget year develops. And there was some discussion at the end of the session about that number being 100, but we feel like the number ought to be 50, but that'll be part of the discussions I know that will take place during this week.
So 1% would be 260 million. So if you're talking about $50 million, you're talking about a quarter of 1%.
Yeah, you're not, in the big scheme of things, the dollars we talk about in the state government, this is not a huge amount that is up for debate one way or the other. This is the philosophical debate that's taken place, and the leadership in the House is seeking to make certain that not all the dollars are appropriated, I believe, so that it lowers the amount of money that will be in the base budget next year going forward. When we know we have the cliff, we're saying don't force government to have to make the dramatic cuts that are going to be necessitated. And those discussions took place in front of the Senate Finance Committee, and they were convinced. They're going to take place in front of the House Committee today. I don't know that that committee's going to be convinced, but we believe it's irresponsible to put these agencies in a situation where they're having to take additional cuts beyond what they've already done. And don't lose sight of the fact that we've been cutting this budget. We've been reducing these agencies at a mid-year basis and also on the front end as we try to be more efficient in what we do in government. And that seems to get lost in a lot of the discussion that we don't want to cut. Well, it's because we've cut. And the departments are now telling the legislature, this is what's going to happen if I don't have these dollars. This would be the first year, if the Senate budget was passed, this would be the first year in a decade that higher education was not cut. TOPS would be fully funded and higher education would not take a reduction. And the notion that if TOPS is fully funded, it's okay to cut higher education indicates a complete misunderstanding of funding for higher education in the budget. And that's exactly the problem we faced for the last decade, where tuition rose higher than any other state in America, and state support dropped faster and more than any other state in America. And we've got to get things in better equilibrium. Yes?
Why is the budget more likely to pass in the next 8 days than it was in the previous 90?
Why is the budget more likely to pass in the next 8 days than it was in the previous 90? Well, the answer is it's now the entire focus of a week with nothing else to distract the legislators, and they are facing the reality of, once again, saying to the public, I can't do the job that you elected me to do. We can't reach an agreement. We can't enact a state budget, which would be the height of irresponsibility. And I'm hoping that people are realizing that. And as I've said, I believe and we believe that had the House had an opportunity to vote on that Senate resolution I referred to, that Senate concurrent resolution, and the HB1 as amended by the Senate, we wouldn't be in a special session right now.
How much does it cost?
How much does it cost? I don't know. I know there's an article about it, so y'all can tell me. I didn't see that. I didn't read that article as to how much it's costing, but I want $60,000 a day. $60,000 a day for the legislature to be here. And they took the Friday, Saturday, Sunday off. The House is back today. The Senate's not back, I think, until Tuesday afternoon or Wednesday. But the Senate doesn't have anything to do. I mean, I can't fault the Senate for not being here, because they literally have nothing to do until the House acts.
Jay, are legislators paid the days that they don't even meet?
Our legislators pay the days that they don't even meet, yes. They're paid for every day in the session call, whether they meet or not.
Appropriations Committee earlier raised the possibility of, instead of setting aside $200 million, we appropriate it and then decide beforehand if there's a shortfall, where you're going to cut. Just taking, I guess, a step out of the process, back to the citing. Can you explain the administration's position on that, starting from there,
I can't, because I can't explain that position to you. So in order to explain the administration's reaction, I have to have a better understanding of what John was talking about, because I wasn't following exactly what he was proposing. We're not in favor of contingent funding, where you would say we're only going to fund this if such and such happens. And if I understood, and I'm not sure I did, what he was trying to accomplish was to identify exactly where some holdbacks would be, and I'm just not sure that's a reasonable approach to take. The folks can testify to what they, in fact, they will be testifying as to what they won't do if the House proposal is adopted. And I told John that's the best indicator of what would be on the chopping block, the things that they're not going to fund if you don't give them the appropriation to do so.
Who speaks for the House?
Who speaks for the House is the question. You will have to ask the House who speaks for itself. Yes, sir.
How much of this goes back to the average voter that influence their legislators, maybe more so than the ones that would be willing to change their vote? From images like police officers on the road that go from 89,000 to 140,000, and other things that we always see independently in the newspaper about these kind of excesses. Do you think that has an underlying current that changes the story year after year?
I'm going to paraphrase your question. Is it correct that there's a basic mistrust of the public of what happens down here, and they see particular instances that frustrate them, and so they just say, well, that's business as usual. I think that's absolutely a part of what goes on here. I think there are a lot of people who don't like government to begin with, and there are a lot of people whose trust or mistrust of government is being shaped by a lot of the political rhetoric that is out there, and it's also being shaped by an awful lot of money that is being spent by special interests on all sides to try and make their voice heard. And I think this is something we, unfortunately, and I think it is unfortunately, better get used to, because the new laws regulating campaign financing and regulating expenditures in general are going to create a situation where wealthy groups and wealthy individuals can bankroll negative campaigns against candidates and informational campaigns on issues that are going to wind up being persuasive with a public who is going to believe what they hear on the internet, see on the internet, hear on the nightly news, or whatever the case may be. So it is an ongoing problem. It's nothing new, but I think it is exacerbated in just the climate that we're in right now. And I knew I'd have to mention this sooner or later, the partisan nature of what's taking place in Louisiana right now. We see it on a national scale. We talk about how we wanted to avoid that coming to Louisiana. I took this job because I wanted to be involved in trying to craft bipartisan solutions. But it is the political reality of the day that we're facing.
Inevitably, in the case that there is a shortfall, it's mid-year and it exceeds $50 million, there will inevitably be some pointing the finger saying, I told you so. What will the administration's response be to that?
That it was the responsible thing to do to make certain that these dollars were appropriated for us to be responsible in preparing for those cuts, and we'll be prepared for them, just like we were last year. Nobody made us do it or told us to do it. In that first mid-year cut, which was $303 million, I believe, we were able to deal without massive cuts and reductions because departments had been preparing for it and knew that they might be coming. We got to that second $310 million shortfall, that became a bit of a problem, and we had more significant cuts. But if in fact we have a shortfall, which is very much a possibility, I mean, certainly you look at what's happened in the past, we may very well not reach our budget expectations this year, but our belief is the responsible thing to do is appropriate the money, put on the brakes where necessary, and don't put ourselves in a situation where we're spending more than we think we have to.
What if perchance we should end up getting out some more emergency funding with respond to floods and some other funding rolling into Louisiana? Let's look at the other side of the coin. What if you get some additional money? Then how does the budget process handle that?
The question is, what if we get additional money in response to the flood from the federal government? How does the budget process handle that? It's completely outside the purview of HB1, of the General Appropriations Bill, because it's dedicated for the specific purpose of flood relief. The money has to be spent in accordance with a plan that's been submitted by the state to the federal government. And the legislature is going to be briefed on, and I don't remember the status of legislation as to whether they have any approval authority on any new dollars that come in, but they've obviously expressed an interest in what happens, and we've made it clear we're going to talk to them about how new money is spent. But every dollar that we get from the federal government is spent in accordance with a plan that we've submitted, and the money has to be spent accordingly, or we don't get it.
But if the plan is carried out by various agencies of government, it would have an impact then on their operational budget too. Say if state police had to reimburse themselves for something, or if education had to do something in terms of money they've already set aside. Do you look at it holistically? I think the average person says, for instance, I'm looking at LSU's library and it's leaking for 20 years and it needs to be fixed. And yet I see a new, brand new building being built. That's the reality. How do we look at everything as a whole?
Right, so the question deals with the LSU library leaking and a new building is being built, how you deal with that, but the public perception of that, and the answer is we're trying to be more responsible with the capital outlay bill, and that's a whole other topic of discussion, but we've allocated dollars for the first time ever in a pool for deferred maintenance on state buildings and college campuses and for highway and road improvements, which has never been done before. And we have been very cautious in approving new construction on college campuses. There have been a couple of projects that have been approved, but we're telling colleges, don't be building new stuff when we can't take care of what we've got. And we're going to continue that mindset because we also have some huge challenges in capital outlay, and this is a whole other topic of discussion, but we can only use 6% of the state general fund budget on capital outlay. So we're hitting that cap. As revenue decreases to the state, it means less projects can be done. But the legislature has ballooned the capital outlay bill back like it used to be, and so the governor will have his veto pen out, I can assure you, on that capital outlay bill whenever it passes because it's just too bloated.
So that's still at play?
It's still at play. They wouldn't know what it looked like, but...
Last question.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned groups that advertise heavily for a particular issue. I think one was pretty prominent with regard to the gas tax that Beth mentioned. And the figure that has been widely thrown out is 11% is the amount that went to actual concrete bridge construction. In fact, your great friend David Vitter has been recorded as making that comment. It's been said that figure is misleading. Ms. Robinson, the Revenue Secretary, said that figure is no longer at that level. You're the CFO of the state. Can you give us the approximate percentage that is devoted in DOTD to administrative costs and your assessment of whether you think there could be further efficiency there?
I can't, as I stand here right now, I can't give you that exact
Ballpark?
percentage, but I'm not going to hazard a specific guess, but I'm telling you they're doing better. And one of the reasons why is because of all the attention that was brought to bear on the Transportation Trust Fund dollars being redirected to state police and to local government. And those numbers have both come down very dramatically. And so the Transportation Trust Fund dollars, and one of the arguments against the tax was, well, we're not going to pass any more revenue until we know those Transportation Trust Fund dollars are being spent as they should be.
Yes.
And we're doing everything we can to make certain that we engender that trust and people believe that to be the case, because just because the tax didn't pass doesn't mean the needs are going to go away or that our problems on roads are going to get any better. And so sooner or later, we're going to have to, as a state, face that music. And never before was there as much of an effort in favor of passing a tax that we saw this session. And even with all that effort from business groups and others, it still couldn't get the votes in the House. So we know there's still a lot more work to do.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.